Thank you, Father Kevin. It sounds great, but don't believe them. So this morning I want to speak to you about St. Teresa of Avila and her major writings, The Life, the Way of Perfection, and the Interior Castle. Let us begin with the life, then. Teresa wrote her life for the first time at the age of 47 in the Toledan palace of Doña Luisa de la Cerda. She didn't write it in the severe walled precincts of the Carmelite cloister of St. Joseph's, the monastery she founded, but in the magnificent surroundings of a noble palace. She finished it probably in the spring of that year, in June 1562. The text of this redaction has been lost. We do not know its plan. With all probability, it consisted of two sections. One, to recount her early life, her sins, as she refers to it, and the other, to tell of her mystical experiences, which she calls the favors of God. An increasing wave of mystical graces forced her to write in order to understand herself. Among these mystical graces was a recent one that gave her the capacity to overcome the mystical ineffability, because she says it's one grace to receive the favor from God, it's another to understand what favor you are receiving, and it's a third to be able to write about it, to express it. So now she is able to speak and write about what was happening in her. And when she was about ready to finish the writing, there took place the decisive encounter with the Dominican Padre Garcia de Toledo, for whom she wrote the second redaction, because he wanted more. He saw, oh, here's something great. The second redaction is the only one that has reached us. She writes at the command of her confessors also, but at the same time through an interior impulse of mystical grace. Among those commanding her to write, two stand out. On the one hand, the Inquisitor, Francisco de Soto. He did not command her to write, but simply suggested it to her, since he saw her so anxious and that she might be at rest. The reason for her not being at rest was that the mystical element related to her in her life comes about beginning when Teresa was 39 to 40 years old, 1554 to 1565. Mostly all of it took place in Avila. The external mark of the city at this time is that it suffers from a double hostility, social and religious, toward the mystical phenomena in women visionaries, whether from the pseudo-mystical episodes that had recently occurred in Spain, since at that time other women had fallen into serious illusions and deceptions by the devil, Teresa writes. That's her immediate words. Whether through an iron attitude of the Inquisition with regard to the Illuminists, severe times she refers to them, or whether from episodes of the famous Avilan Marie Diaz, an exceptional woman who had nothing of these illusions. Hence the two hostile forces that frame from nearby Teresa's mystical experience. On the one hand, the permanent harassment of her religious assessors, inclined to fear hidden demons in these events, and on the other, Teresa herself, who, far from welcoming them in the psychological context of favor, cedes to the alarm and is frightened by what is happening to her. She is very systematically on guard against herself. And when the interior fact becomes public, raptures, not only does she blush, but would prefer to be buried alive. she says in her chapter 31 of her life, and even thinks seriously about flight to another far-off Carmel where no one would know her. That is to say, the Teresian mystical fact does not arise in an environment of favor, and neither applauded, magnified by the chorus of spectators, nor does Teresa herself have the least temptation to histrionics or exhibitionism. In her, the mystical fact goes against the grain. The inquisitor, Soto, to help Teresa, merely suggests that she write the book and submit it to Master John of Avila. On the other hand, among those who ordered her to write was a close theologian friend, the Dominican Garcia de Toledo, who empathized with her and her living experiences, and who not only ordered her to write, but pressured her and closely followed the process of the book and took possession of the writing as soon as it was finished. He needed to know from within the mystical experiences that Teresa was undergoing, and there was raised up in his soul a surge of expectation. Teresa wrote this second redaction then, not in Toledo, but in Avila, at the poor writing desk of her cell. She was on her knees. It wasn't really a desk. She wrote it according to herself with many breaks, and little by little, stealing time, because it keeps me from spiritual spinning. It keeps me from spinning. She was 50 at the time that she wrote the life. The book of her life is generally known as Teresa's autobiography. Nonetheless, it is not strictly speaking an autobiography. It doesn't comprise in its complexity the history of the author. Its autobiographical content is partial and only in sections. Its plan develops only the thread of Teresa's relationship with God, yet giving more space and relief to God's relations with her. She is interested above all in resolving a pressing problem that underlies the whole narrative. What meaning does this intervention of God in my life have? Why does it always increase until taking complete possession of her? Teresa wants to clarify herself, and for those ordering her to write, the meaning of her life, not only by referring to it, but by understanding and interpreting it. From Teresa's viewpoint, this relationship between God and herself is concentrated on prayer as a sharing in friendship. For this reason, there is interpolated in the account a long parenthesis on the degrees of prayer. Teresa begins by recounting her life and prayer in her home environment and the highs and lows of her conduct that frames her prayer, or abandonment of prayer, or the recovery of the truth she knew in childhood. The family, the readings, the vocation to the Carmelite life, her illnesses. She told the story of her infidelities that she believed incompatible with the mystical graces which came upon her. All of this she covers up to chapter 9. Chapter 10 connects with a change of direction in the account. From here on, the matter must be kept secret. But first, Teresa feels the need to set forward a key to the reading with an outline of the degrees of prayer. From chapter 16, we have the degrees of prayer that Teresa is experiencing at the time that she's writing this book. In chapter 22, she introduces into the text an interpolation on the humanity of Christ. For without this, taking this into account, the mystical fact that ensues in the third section of the book will be hardly intelligible. In chapter 23 to 31, she tells of the most burning facts of the mystical life, the relations of God with her. Teresa has entered experientially into the mysterious sphere of the presence of God. First, she listens. She receives locutions from God. And then she sees. She sees visions of Christ in his humanity. She doesn't understand, but there follow two powerful experiences. First, for the sake of her scattered affection, the Lord spoke to her and said, she didn't know it was the Lord at first, "No longer do I want you to converse with men, but with angels." And then to illumine the mind and disengage it from human theories. When that came about when the books, her favorite books, were put on the index. She couldn't read them anymore, and she was sad because she loved spiritual reading. And she heard the words, "I shall be for you a living book." From that time, she wrote her own books, and she didn't need books anymore. Then Jesus Christ becomes present and installs himself in her life. But all of this did not remain in a closed interiority or in an ecstatic contemplation. The mystical contemplation turned into an imperative, an impelling call to action with regard to others. Then comes an absolute novelty for her life. Teresa received the command to found a monastery. This was seen as the wrong thing to do by almost all the surrounding learned men and by her superiors. In contrast, also with the peace of her life in the old monastery of the Incarnation. It was almost against the common sense of Teresa herself, who had no means to found a monastery, because in those days they were founded by people of the high nobility that had the money to support them. The book then centers on the commission of making the foundation of St. Joseph's in Avila. The life is an anonymous narration. We know that it's written by Teresa, so we read her into it and all where she lived in all these places. We know from the note, but when she wrote it, it was an anonymous work. She didn't mention herself. She didn't mention where any of these places were. She just said in a city and so on. So it is so programmed by Teresa that it states neither the name nor the title of the book. She presents it in some as an account that my confessors commanded me to write in the prologue. She doesn't give the name of the city Avila. She just calls it this place. Nor does she give the name of the monastery in which the scenes are framed, the Incarnation, or St. Joseph. Nor does she give the names of her companions along the way. Of the 100 persons who populate the account, only three out of 50, appear with an uncovered face by Peter of Alcantara, St. Peter of Alcantara, then Francisco, who is the Jesuit Duke of Gandia, St. Francis Borgia, and then John of Avila, Father Master John of Avila, because he was a highly esteemed person who later became a saint, but he was highly esteemed by Teresa and everyone else in that time. So when she has finished the account, she writes a letter of consignment, also without mentioning the name of the one for whom the book is destined. That was for Garcia de Toledo, and she gave it to him. She beseeched this unnamed person to arrange to have a copy made if they are going to bring it to Padre Master John of Avila, since someone might recognize her handwriting. So have someone copy it for you and then bring it to him, so that he doesn't know who it is. And the desire for anonymity was not due, as has been said, to her intention of being silent about her condition as a woman. No. On the contrary, she does not hide this fact from the reader, that the one writing is a little woman, wretched, weak, and fearful like myself, a woman wretched and without learning, without instruction from a learned man. normally obliged to spin, for this is a poor house. She gives an account, for example, of her trip from Avila to Toledo and return from Toledo to Avila, and was careful not to give the name of either of the two cities. Having finished the first part, and before taking up the narration of her mystical experiences, Teresa gives the title of the new chapter thus: Asks the one to whom this is sent to keep secret what she writes from here on, for they commanded her to speak so personally about the favors the Lord grants her. And in the body of the chapter she formulates categorically the petition: As for what I say or write from here on, I do not give this permission, nor do I desire, if they should show it to someone, that they tell who it is who has experienced these things or who has written this. As a result, I will not mention my name or the name of anyone else, but I will write everything as best I can so as to remain unknown. And this I ask for the love of God. That is to say, not only anonymity on the part of the author, but secrecy imposed on the reader. Yet spiritually she lives in a situation totally new, in a zone on the frontier between life and death, without any fear of death, which I always feared greatly, she says. She observes as though from up high the mechanisms of social life, the farce over money and honor. All things seem to me like an anthill. Everything I see with my bodily eyes seems to be a dream. Merely to look toward heaven recollects the soul. She is secure in thinking that never does he neglect me. Likewise, she is convinced that there are few who have arrived at the experience of so many things. As a result, in the depths of her psychology, there prevails the gesture of amazement expressed with her typical words, to be frightened or amazed, repeated with different nuances 22 times in these chapters. The most determining factor in this amazement is the dynamic of the desires and the attitude of hope. She lives against the clock. I am consoled to hear the clock strike, for at the passing away of that hour of life, it seems to me I am drawing a little closer to the vision of God. The hour of seeing God is now measured by the parameter of death. Hence the classic motto, Lord, either to die or to suffer. I don't ask for anything else for myself. Another alternative meaning is to die is to see Him. Not to die is to work for the good of others. For His glory, to work for the good of others for His glory. I would like some soul to profit a little by all that can be said about me, since I have been living in this house, St. Joseph. The Lord has been pleased that all my desires converge upon this one, and He has given me a kind of sleep in life, or it almost always seems to me that I'm dreaming what I see. The final balance, this is the way in which I now live, Lord and my Father. She sums up this strong tension between the eschatological, to die in order to see God, and the ecclesiological, to live serving others. It is the classical Pauline dilemma in Philippians. I do not know which I shall choose. At bottom, Teresa is convinced that the end is near, yet she will live 17 years more, and they will be years of permanent service, and that's how the life ends. So she founded this monastery of St. Joseph in Avila, a small monastery of love, and this led to another book, The Way of Perfection. As with the life, The Way of Perfection was also redacted twice by Teresa. But in this case we conserve both redactions. The first autograph is conserved in the library of the Escorial, which was King Philip II's library, and he ordered that after her death, that all St. Teresa's works be sent to his library, and he would keep them there. And so that's the library of Escorial, and Teresa's works that were sent to him, because they didn't send him all, they didn't send all her works to him, they kept some in the monasteries where they thought they'd be safer. But anyway, so that's called the Way of Perfection. It's referred to as E, Way E. And the second autograph is conserved in the Carmel of Valladolid. It's one of Teresa's foundations and is referred to as Way V. And so when I visited that monastery, they were very generous, and they gave me the book, and I held it in my hands, and that precious autograph of St. Teresa's, the second redaction of the Carmelite Way of Perfection. The second redaction had a wide manuscript diffusion in Teresa's contemporary Carmels. She personally corrected several of the copies made, because you always make mistakes when you're copying a book in those days. That's the only way. They didn't have. So they'd look and then they'd miss something. So Teresa wrote the first autograph, Way E, at St. Joseph's in Avila for the nascent community of 10 or 12 nuns, of whom she was prioress and formator. She wrote it around 1566 at the request of those for whom it was destined, dialoguing with them as daughters, friends, and sisters. The Carmelite nuns had known that their priors had written the book of her life for certain learned men, and had have urged me so persistently that I put in writing the lessons that I impart in words to them daily. The book was born in this climate of reciprocal confidence, intimacy, and love, testified to in the prologue. The autograph of the second redaction, Way V, Valladolid, it was written at St. Joseph's in Avila, probably at the end of 1566, or the beginning of the following year, without any interval after the former redaction. From time to immemorial, it has been conserved in the Carmel of Valladolid. In one of the folios at the beginning, Teresa wrote, at a later date, the dedicatory words, "This book deals with the advice and counsel Teresa of Jesus gives to her religious sisters and daughters." Another hand wrote a new title on the reverse side of the folio, book called The Way of Perfection. And in continuation, Teresa herself wrote, "This book is intended for discalced nuns who observe the primitive rule of Our Lady of Mount Carmel." The Codex lacks a table of contents. Incorporated into the text are the titles of the chapters, reducing them to 42. All of this was revised by the censors with erasures, underlinings, and marginal notes, which obliged Teresa to tear out various folios. Among them were the 4 folios that developed the comparison to the game of chess. Already Teresa's time, the Way of Perfection had a normal diffusion in the Carmels founded by Teresa. It was the book of formation in the spirit and style of Teresa. She herself frequently took an interest in reviewing these copies, done at times quickly. She regretted the lapses and errors incurred by the impromptu copyists. For the indispensable approbation of the book, Teresa had to have recourse to her Dominican friend, again, Padre Garcia de Toledo, who had a good knowledge of the preceding book of her life. Padre Garcia accepted for love of Teresa the commission of being the assessor and censor of the Way of Perfection. Padre Garcia went over the first 20 pages without any problem. But when he comes unexpectedly to the passage in which Teresa gives her defense of women with clear allusions to the Inquisition, she writes, "Since the world's judges are sons of Adam, and all of them men, there is no virtue of women that they do not hold suspect. He frowns and decides to do away with this whole passage as being dangerous. He leaves it unreadable, but without any marginal note to say why, only that from this moment on he remains alert and burdens the book with notes and scribbles, entire pages crossed out with an X. He corrects Teresa when she tries to comment on Psalm 88. This is not the meaning of this psalm, he writes. Before the allusions to the index of forbidden books, he seriously warns her. It seems she is reproving the inquisitors for forbidding books on prayer, and erases the dangerous allusion. Probably it is due to the warnings of Padre Garcia that Teresa tore out the redid various pages that spoke of pure love, or likewise cut out 4 pages that treated of humility and the game of chess. Fortunately, all the other passages crossed out by the censor in the autograph have been recovered by the editors. Thus we can read them in their original integrity, despite the strength of the smudges that were intended to expurgate what was crossed out. After this work of the censor and the consequent meddling of the theologian in the text of the Way of Perfection, the question spontaneously arises: didn't Teresa succumb to outside criteria? Didn't she have to renounce her own ideas? To what degree were the ideas in the book, Teresa's original thinking, contaminated by foreign ideas or theses? The answer is in the negative. It is certain that the crossings out and smudges in the text made the author tone down her expressions and even her thought, yet it doesn't seem that even one of the numerous notes of Padre Garcia in both autographs or of the other censors of the second autograph had any impact or distorted even so much as one of the ideas expressed by Teresa or made her retract. The initial project of the book did not arise from a proposal made by Teresa. It was rather an idea agreed upon between her and the group of young Carmelite nuns, members of the community in St. Joseph's in Avila. Probably it was one of the topics of conversation in the community recreation. The sisters kept urging her to write, and she gave in finally. I've decided to obey them. The proposal by the nuns was generic, that I write some things about prayer. Teresa specified more at the beginning of the book that I managed to say something about the mode and manner of life proper to this house, something that will be of benefit to them. She writes first in the Escorial. Obviously, the manner of life lived in St. Joseph's was a life of prayer. Teresa excluded the use of strange books. Although she is aware that there are those that are very well written for whoever knows what the author is writing about. She will write whatever she will be thinking as she goes along without order, she assures. She prefers to pay attention to a model that keeps her away from theories and approaches. What is experienced? I shall say nothing about what I have not experienced myself or seen in others. So she just writes the way she speaks. Further on, she will include in the project an important double commentary. She will comment on the Our Father and the Hail Mary, she says. In fact, she does do the Our Father, but then she gives up on her promise to comment on the Hail Mary. I have also thought of saying something about how to recite the Hail Mary, but I have been so lengthy that I have to let it go. So this is in the last chapter or epilogue of the first redaction. Likewise, in passing on to the second redaction, she had to retouch the initial criteria of not writing except what she experienced. I shall say nothing that I haven't experienced or was given to me to understand in prayer by the Lord. That is to say, the source of the writing will be her own mystical experience. Yet this last aside did not pass into the new or the reaction. She will tend to this norm as she goes along in the book. She will reduce the references to her mystical experience. Perhaps it was one of the guidelines suggested by the censor. Not too many personal allusions or comparisons to games. For example, the bull run or the game of chess. The structure of the book does not respond to a pre-established plan. She doesn't do her outline first. She had already warned of this in the prologue. She will deal with themes as they come to mind while she's writing, just as when we have a conversation. Giving free course to her pen, she nevertheless keeps in order some convictions and the corresponding set of ideas that serve her as a basis for what she writes. She knows well the style of life that she has established in St. Joseph's for the group of Carmelite nuns for whom the book is destined, in such a way that the work is articulated in two parts, almost two halves. The first part deals with the education for prayer. The second part deals with the prayer itself, which is the reason for the life in the house and the principal objective of the book. The conducting thread of her thought is simple: to live a life of prayer. One must previously base it on daily life. So this is the focus that she follows in the development of from the beginning in the first part. And the book starts off with what is fundamental, why and for what we are here in such strict enclosure. And the response is almost disconcerting because in France, in Europe, and in the church, terrible things are happening. Wars of religion, the breakup of Christianity, things that affect the entire world. The world is in flames. They want to ravage the church. We are here for the purpose of being such that by our manner of living and being, Christians, we will carry some weight in the conflict. The contemplative life must have an apostolic function and reason for being. And immediately she specifies concrete aspects: pure love for each other, detachment from all created things, and humility. These are the three virtues, and they really include all virtues of you. These are how they must live their life, with love for one another, with detachment, and with humility. And so she goes and begins to analyze them. These virtues configure the manner of the house, of the life in this house. Love will create the unity of the group. Detachment will facilitate freedom in its depth. Whenever you're anxious about something, just see, am I detached? And you will see that you are not detached, and that's why you're so anxious. So, well, that was just an aside. Humility will authenticate everything. Humility is truth. She says, but, it goes on, and the truth is that we have no good thing of ourselves. Whatever is good we have from God. Whatever is evil is from ourselves. So that's the truth of humility. It will be the truth along the way. The second part of the book imparts a strong reading about prayer, to decide for it with a radical, determined determination to persevere no matter what comes till the end. Prayer is learned by practicing it. Teresa teaches it by praying herself before her readers. For this she prays with them the Our Father, and with Jesus, and like Jesus, she assumes the sentiments he directs to the Father. For this reason, her treatise on prayer will be a free commentary on the Lord's Prayer. In introducing the image of the fount, she will say that after the battle, the living water is the reward. Effectively, the new image of the fount of living water of which the Lord spoke to the Samaritan woman arises as the final aim of the struggle after conquering the first enemies without backing down from the second or the third. And she develops as she goes on the little image of the biblical origin, expounding on the three properties of water, the three properties of prayer. It refreshes, it cleans dirty things, and it satisfies to the full and takes away thirst. This is what prayer does too. It refreshes, it cleanses dirty things, and satisfies to the full and takes away thirst. The book is the way to this fount of living water. Now, the third book of Teresa's is The Interior Castle. We saw how at the end of her life she thought she was going to die. Well, she had many more years to go, and then after a number of years she wrote The Interior Castle. So in writing The Interior Castle, Teresa proposed at the outset to compose a treatise fundamentally theological. She was advised to disguise her identity so that there would be no trouble with the Inquisition. So she speaks of herself all the way through. You don't realize, but she never mentions her name. She hides her identity. Because they said, well, you might get into... Because her life had been taken by the Inquisition, and they were having trouble. And so Teresa said, I explained that very well in my life, if only people could read it. And he said, well, why don't you write another book, but disguise your identity so that they won't know. So she disguised her identity in The Interior Castle so that there would be no trouble with the Inquisition. In her life, the little treatise on the degrees of prayer, aimed at basing it on the truths of sacred Scripture, may God deliver us, she said, from foolish devotions. Thus, now, from the first part of The Interior Castle, she quotes three biblical texts that have a high resonance in her thinking. The human soul has great beauty and capacity since it was created in the image and likeness of God. Second, the soul has many dwelling places, just as in heaven there are many dwelling places. The basic theme that she will develop in remembering that Jesus fulfills the word that we will come, the three, and make our dwelling in the Christian, that passage from Scripture, and then three, and that God finds his delight in the children of men, from Proverbs, which always had a great resonance in Teresa's soul, and that will determine the development or the framework of the book. From the time of her first mystical experiences, when a feeling of the presence of God would come upon me unexpectedly, so that I could in no way doubt that he was written within me, or I totally immersed in him, she was made aware of the mystery of the presence of God. Rooted in this fact is her comprehension of the capacity of the soul. The human soul is capable of God. That is to say, from the depths of its being, she is open to transcendence. Her soul is not locked up in itself, but has a primordial call from God. The motto from Proverbs, that he finds his delight in the children of men, served her as the basis for developing the relational process of the dwelling places, until in the final dwelling place, the relation is converted into an inseparable union, as two drops of water fallen into the sea, or two rays of sunlight illuminating the same room. These two theological presuppositions serve to establish the exposition of the Interior Castle. The fact of the presence of God and the truth gotten from Proverbs, that is, the delightful relationship of God with humans, or better, the interrelationship between the two, not only on the loving, affective plane, but even more so in the depth of the human being. The human is a paradise for God. The 7 dwelling places are not 7 rooms, but 7 degrees of life, or of communion of the human with the divine. Teresa bases her exposition on an image, the castle, which is at the same time a castle of diamond or very clear crystal. And the castle as a warrior's dwelling place with battlements and walls and ditches. These are susceptible of a twofold symbolism, either of light and illumination or of struggle and victory. In the development of the work, she superimposes a series of images that stake out the steps of the process at the same time as they assume the basic theological themes in such a way that the images carry out a double function, literary and theological. In outline, they are the following. The castle of the soul. This is the underlying image of the whole exposition. It determines the structure and the figured language of the book. It serves, first of all, to give a sketch of the human being, body, soul, spirit, or center of the soul. Transcendent relationship of the human person with God. It comments as well on the gospel text about the indwelling and the mystical Trinitarian experience. Perhaps the most relevant point in the imagery of the interior castle is the openness of the human being to the divinity, the radical vocation of each one of us to transcendence. The two water founts, well, that's the castle. Now we have the two water founts, the artificial and far away, which brings the water through a series of aqueducts. The other from a trough over a spring that flows from the deepest and most secret places of the human being, to symbolize the contrast between human effort to bring the water by the aqueducts. And in fact, in Granada, you can see the monastery where St. John of the Cross lived on that property, an aqueduct that he built because they didn't have water, and he got the king's permission to transfer the water from the place next door, which the Alhambra, the famous Alhambra. So so they brought the water. So that was much work to build that and bring the water. But if you found a fount of water right there and then it would spring up from the earth. So these are the two images that she uses. The spring that flows from the deepest and most secret place of the human being to symbolize the contrast between human effort, the asceticism of bringing water through aqueducts, and the divine gift, the trough that fills with water. For Teresa, the water is always an image of life. I don't find anything more appropriate to explain some spiritual experiences than water. The two sources symbolize the two forms of natural and supernatural. In the Teresian lexicon, supernatural equals mystical. So the silkworm then is another image that is reborn as a butterfly, an image that for Teresa has a Christological sense. The metamorphosis of the worm images our transformation into Christ that develops along the three final dwelling places so as to highlight the arrival at freedom in Christ, because the butterfly flies around freely, as the flight of the butterfly that has freed itself from the sheath of the cocoon. It comes out of the cocoon, the worm comes out as a beautiful butterfly. Then the nuptial image, which serves Teresa to articulate the three last dwelling places, the meetings, the betrothal, and marriage, as it was had in those days in Teresa's time. It has the appearance of a sociological image, but in reality it is inspired by the symbolism of the Song of Songs, which she does not interpret in an ecclesiological sense, but in an individual sense, as the process of love between God and the soul, until culminating in the mystical union of the two, as the supreme milestone of the Christian life, understood as a process of love in which the determining factor is the divine love. The same as for the way of perfection, the interior castle is also inspired by Teresa's own living experience. The trajectory of the 7 dwelling places has an autobiographical undercurrent. They are above all the 7 dwelling places lived by Teresa. To her personal experience, she joins many other experiences of life known by her. Above all, the experiences themselves of her immediate readers. And in the full mystical exposition, there emerges a reference to Fray John of the Cross and his experience, which matches Teresa's. I know a person or 2 persons, one was a man, just the other was herself, to whom the Lord had granted some of these favors, who were so desirous of serving His Majesty at their own cost without these great delights, and so anxious to suffer that they complained to our Lord because He bestowed these favors on them, and if they could decline receiving these gifts, they would do so. It's easy for us to glimpse Fray John of the Cross in this anonymous person. The central idea presented in the last dwelling place, the term of the process and objective of the book, is Teresa's final experiences, not told in the book of her life, since it was happening to her only in her last 5 years. They were precisely the experiences of her situation in those years and those that explained the reason for all her former experiences. For this reason, in the 7 dwelling places, she will deal with the theme from a clearly autobiographical perspective, not from some theoretical premises, but from sanctity as it was realized in her. From her own peephole, she extended her gaze to the mystery of Christian sanctity in itself. Teresa does not use this word sanctity. She never uses the word sanctity in her entire exposition. She takes as her aim, above all, the ideal sanctity, that is, the sanctity incarnated in biblical types or in the models of sanctity, such as Paul or the Magdalene or the symbol and the bride of the Song of Songs. They are the ones most recurring as the archetypes of the highest love of God. There will appear also in these dwelling places Saint Elijah, the one who hungered for the glory of God, Saint Peter in Rome, saints closer such as Saint Francis and Saint Dominic, or Father Ignatius, the founder of the Society of Jesus. There emerges above all Christ as the absolute model. She repeats her initial watchword, "Fix your eyes on the crucified." So the exposition, rarely has she been so systematic and well-ordered. She analyzes the theme and expounds it in 4 chapters, perfectly organized, in which are the 4 fundamental components of the Christian sanctity. That is, sanctity is above all Trinitarian and Christian, departing from the Christological fact. That's chapter 2. So the first chapter is Trinitarian and Christian. Sanctity is above all Trinitarian and Christian. Then the second chapter, departing from the Christological fact, the spiritual marriage. Then the third chapter, realizing the human plenitude of the new human being. And then the fourth, it is an ecclesial fact that situates the Christian in full service. So how she experienced the Trinity in her soul in the 7th dwelling place, the union comes about in a different way. Our good God now desires to remove the scales from the soul's eyes and let it see and understand. Brought into the dwelling place, the most blessed Trinity, all 3 persons are revealed to it, and an enkindling in the Spirit in the manner of a cloud of magnificent splendor. Here are all 3 persons communicating themselves to it. They speak to it and explain those words of the Lord in the Gospel, that in the end, that He and the Father and the Holy Spirit will come to dwell with the soul that loves Him and keeps His commandments. O God, help me, how different is hearing and believing these words from understanding their truth in this way. You may think that as a result the soul will be outside itself and so absorbed that it will be unable to be occupied with anything else. On the contrary, the soul is much more occupied than before with everything pertaining to the service of God. Then in chapter 2 we have the Christological fact. With other persons the favor will be received in another form. With regard to the one whom we are speaking, the Lord represented himself to her just after she had received communion in the form of shining splendor and majesty, and he told her that now it was time that she consider as her own what belonged to him, and that he would take care of what was hers. It is the fact of the spiritual marriage. She takes care of his things, he takes care of hers. Chapter 3 treats of the great effects caused by this prayer. To the preceding words of Christ, she responds as does St. Paul, "What would you have me to do, Lord?" As in her poem, "What do you want of me?" And she enumerates the 4 features that characterize the new self. A forgetfulness of self that makes it truly seem that one no longer is. 2, a great desire to suffer, but not in a way that disquiets as it did before. For the desire is extreme that God's will be done in it. 3, these souls have a great interior joy when persecuted without any hostility toward those who do them wrong. 4, the strong eschatological tension ceases, longing for heaven, and like St. Paul, prefers service. This is what amazes it most of all. It would like to live till the end of time to serve the Lord. Again, the model in chapter 4, the model figures appear. Above all, Christ crucified, his glorious mother and the apostles, St. Paul with his most severe trials, St. Peter, the Magdalene, our Father Elijah. The hour has arrived for a sacrificing and unconditional work for the Church. What joy do you think is the reason for these inspirations? What do you think is the reason for these inspirations and other messages that the soul receives from the interior center to the people at the top of the castle? That those outside might fall asleep? No, absolutely not. The company it has gives it much greater strength than ever. Do you know what it means to be truly spiritual? It means becoming the slaves of God, marked with his brand, which is that of the cross. Spiritual persons, because they have given him their liberty, can be sold by him as slaves of everyone, as he was. He doesn't thereby do them any harm or grant them a small favor. And again, fix your eyes on the crucified, and everything will become small for you.